Okay, hi everybody and welcome to this special members webinar to preview the findings of the A2P monetization study for MEF's Future of Messaging Programme supported by Tata and Anam. This study looks at the MNO's attitude to enterprise messaging, and specifically looking in more detail at monetization issues, fraud, self-regulation and the future slash RCS. So my name's Tim Green. I'm the features editor for MEF. I'll be moderating today's session. And today we'll be taking a brief tour around the highlight findings of the report. And to do so, I'm joined by Ben Bannister, who is the Director of Mobility and Collaboration Services at Tata Communications, and by Clive, who's the Director of Sales at Anam. And we're also joined by Bryan, who's the CEO of ROCCO Research, and he conducted the study. So we'll be asking him a bit about the methodology. Before we start, just a reminder, this session is going to be recorded. We're going to talk for about 40 minutes. And if you have any questions, please use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. At any point, we'll be looking at that constantly and relaying any questions to the panelists. So before we start, I'm just going to ask Jason to briefly explain when this research took part, who you spoke to, and what your methodology was. So Jason.
Thank you very much, Tim. It's a real pleasure to be here and to be part of this interesting project. Of course, ROCCO Research has been doing A2P SMS research for a number of years, so we have quite a following of operators who are interested to comment on this important business area. So we started to look at this by thinking about the requirements that we would need for this special survey which we conducted. ROCCO is confidential, impartial, independent company, so we wanted to approach the MNOs with pure confidentiality for them to give their feedback directly to us. So in this sense, it's kind of somewhat independent feedback. It's not biased to any specific company or whatever. So the first thing, gathering the requirements, was the interesting part, to understand what were the requirements for A2P in general, for SMS, and also there's some nice questions in the survey about RCS, because we wanted to understand the impacts on that too. Then we designed the survey in cooperation with the design team, and we then started to put the survey out to the operators. And this is done by social media channels, but also from our list of contacts that we have who are specific to the A2P SMS area or to messaging area of MNOs. So it's not, let's say, the general MNO contacts, it's very specific contacts that we're using. Once we get that feedback, one of the first and most important things to do is to validate that the respondee is actually working for a mobile network operator. And this is important to do because we want to have pure data which is really trustworthy and reliable. So we clarified with several MNOs, and we even contacted some to ensure that they were who they said they were. And this is, as I said, an important step to validate the data. Then we're looking at the data, and we're looking at questions, each question as it comes through, to make sure, let's say, the MNO understood the question and they were able to answer accordingly. Not all questions were answered by all MNOs, since they may not have had an opinion on the question, but majority of questions were answered by the majority of the MNOs. So it was quite a good response rate and turnout. Once we've got all of this data validated and we've checked the origin of the participants, then we start to present the findings. And this is simply done on a question by question basis, where we have produced some let's say, thoughts on what are the responses that we've gained. And from this point of view, as is unique with this survey, we then pass those results over to MEF and over to you, Tim, who have presented them so beautifully in your report.
Thank you. Well, I hope that you validated those MNOs using two-factor authentication sent by SMS.
Actually, it's a bit more sophisticated than that. I'll just, if I can explain a second.
Yeah.
when a respondee responds to one of our surveys, we actually capture their IP address. So we
Right.
know exactly the office they're based in. It's a little bit, sounds a bit intrusive, but it's not. Because if we find that some companies are repeatedly filling in the survey from a certain office, we can look at this data. So we are looking, as relevant to this topic, we are also filtering the results very carefully.
And just to clarify, you spoke to over 50 operators and they were all over the world, right?
Right, yeah. I mean, we have, you know, messaging is of course a huge and important business for MNOs, and of course fraud is a very important part of that. Fraud prevention is something that is hugely important. So we were really happy with the participant level that we got, and the diversity of the respondents, and the diversity of MNO types, because obviously we didn't want to know just from the large group operator, but the small group operator, the independent operator. Those are majorly important because the results can diversify a lot. Okay.
All right. Well, thanks for mentioning fraud and monetization, because that's the first slide. So I don't know if we can see the first finding now. So the first finding was about A2P monetization issues, and the top three are all fraud related. They are, here we go, SIM farms, grey routes, spam, and as you can see on that chart there, I should just explain that the operators were asked to rate the top challenges in order of severity. So what we're showing here is which ones were marked as the most severe. So clearly, this graph shows that some, you know, don't appear, don't have any percentages next to them. It's not because they don't consider them a problem; it's because they weren't number one in anyone's list. So with that, maybe I can ask Clive. We've talked before, about the rising challenge, particularly of SIM farms, and how possibly we're seeing some reduction in things like grey routes. I don't know, maybe you can just comment on that.
Yeah, I think, thanks Tim, I think from just our experience of current projects we're working on, we're seeing a big focus on SIM farm detection and prevention. I think some of the earlier challenges around international grey routes are not such a big issue anymore, and the fraudsters have kind of moved to SIM farms as the next way of getting cheap or free A2P SMS, and that's really mirrored in the projects we're doing at the moment. And also, actually, we're seeing in Asia especially a lot of spam problems. Much of that spam is coming from SIM farms, so those two challenges in our experience are going kind of hand in glove. Both the same problem essentially, and we're finding that it's actually not too challenging to shut down those issues, but it takes a bit of focus and a bit of time and a bit of focus on looking at the patterns of usage, etc., in order to protect the network. But I think most of the projects we're working on at the moment, those two issues, spam and SIM farms, are the big challenges that our customers want us to address.
Is there any reason in terms of, you know, operators' service offerings or policies that have meant that SIM farms have become more of a problem recently?
I think it's purely because the easier fraud routes, like the international grey routes, have been addressed. I think that's really the reason that it's moved to SIM farms. It's just the next opportunity for fraudsters. So I don't think it's any change in the pattern of service. And in fact, in some ways, SIM farms offer a bit of a degraded service compared to a traditional international grey route, because it's harder to mess around with the originating address. For example, you can't send from an alphanumeric address. So it's in a way it's a slightly degraded service for the fraudsters to use SIM farms. but it's really the only option when the international grey routes have been addressed, and other issues like OLO charging issues have also been addressed by operators.
Ben, have you got anything to add on that?
Well, I wonder if I could actually ask a question to Clive. So, you know, I sort of looked at the results. Spam, you know, to me, you know, you say, Clive, that it is associated with sim farming, but also spam. I mean, to me, spam is really about a nuisance factor. I just wonder, as enterprises increase their interest in mobile marketing, or mobility as a marketing channel, how would a company like Anam approach differentiation between legitimate marketing traffic versus you know, illegitimate spam traffic? Do you have any policies on that at the moment?
I think generally spammers don't like to pay. So actually the sort of the normal connectivity into the network for domestic aggregators generally don't get too much spam over that path. We do get it sometimes, but not so much, because generally spammers don't like to pay. And where they really get going is where you have large P2P bundles that they can take advantage of and essentially send messages for virtually free. And in our experience, for example, in Vietnam, we've seen vast amounts of spam traffic, and you know, thousands of SIM cards being blocked every day in order to address the issue. So it's quite a rampant problem. But as I say, I think with the SIM farm challenge, more of the traffic on SIM farms is spammed simply because spammers don't like to pay anything, not just a low price.
Mm-hmm. The other statement I would make is that you know, again, we talked a little bit about grey routing. You know, to me, grey routing is kind of more an arbitrage problem. It's breaking the spirit of the law, if you like, but perhaps not the letter of the law. I just wonder if you had some thoughts about how arbitrage could be reduced in relation to grey routing as well. Is there a legitimate way to simply cut that off, as opposed to purely applying a firewall approach, or are there other techniques, would you think?
Well, I suppose one of the other techniques is many operators are working with a small number of hubs to carry all of their international SMS, and are routinely filtering traffic coming in from other routes. I think that's probably another thing that's driving the end of the kind of traditional international grey route. It's kind of a convenient way of solving the problem, I think.
That's good.
Yeah, it's interesting, you know, whether you call spam a fraud problem or not. I think the answers you've just given there indicate the sort of ambiguity of that. I mean, it's a fraud problem when the senders of spam are avoiding paying, but and so it generally is because these people are, that's the way they are. But yeah, sometimes the definitions, it can be a bit of a grey area whether you call spam fraud or not. Anyway, the next finding is an estimation of how damaging fraud is for operators, and ROCCO's research revealed that on average they think it's about 9.4%. It goes as high as about 32%, I think, with some operators questioned, but the overall average was about 9.4%. And we've looked around at projections around the market for A2P, which I think Mobile Squared has at about 13.27 billion last year. So that's 1.5 billion a year lost. I mean, Ben, do you think that's an accurate kind of assessment of where we are?
Well, this particular statistic interested me a lot because, and again, I'm going to do what I just did, which is ask Jason a question. You know, it would be interesting to understand the criteria by which the mobile network operators actually identify exactly how much traffic really is lost. By definition, if they're losing traffic, I just wonder how easy it is to know how much traffic is being lost. And I think the respondent who provided the 32% figure clearly was taking quite a pessimistic view, but perhaps they're taking a realistic view as well. I don't know, Jason, if you had any thoughts on the actual way that people responded to that particular question.
Yeah, I guess you know, there's all kinds of mobile network operators. Of course, there are, let's say, independent mobile network operators who don't have the benefit of a group, who don't necessarily have the business intelligence information within their organization, and you know, they don't even have the practice, let's say, because maybe they don't have the sophisticated teams that other MNOs have, to look at this as an issue and to really address it. You know, where revenue is being made, of course, it's always a positive result, but where costs, you know, costs aren't always looked at in detail. And I think that this is now a growing trend for more and more operators to look into that. But I mean, I've worked in operators where it's not been possible to exactly measure fraud, and unless there's a specific project dedicated to that, which needs to be a continuous project. You know, you're not really understanding, am I making progress here? Is it a bigger problem than it used to be? Is it a smaller problem? So I can imagine that some MNOs, they don't have the data, whereas more sophisticated groups and larger MNOs, tier one MNOs, yeah, they do have a good handle on it. So that might be the reason why we got the 32%, since there's just may not be the business intelligence to verify. And that's also a very frightening situation.
Yeah, and I think organizations like FASG, as part of the GSMA, you know, they talk about revenue assurance, and this is as much a revenue assurance as a fraud protection issue.
Yes.
And there are revenue assurance processes which, you know, conventionally are associated with revenue reconciliation, and maybe, you know, there's some scope for operators to apply revenue assurance type reconciliation measurement, as well as fraud protection and firewall type protection as well. So I think that's my reaction, my response to that particular statistic.
I would just add one thing, is that there is, I mean, of course, there's specific fraud for SMS, but there are over 50 categories of fraud designed, let's say, accounted for by the GSMA at the moment. And so that's telecoms fraud. So this is going to be really hard for an MNO to get a feel of unless they have the right solutions in place.
I think just wanted to say that from our perspective, I think the number is a bit optimistic. We generally see the level of revenue loss as much higher than that, and I think Jason kind of hit the nail on the head. A lot of operators, unfortunately, just don't really have visibility of all of the traffic that's passing through the network. So actually, it's very difficult to estimate. But I'm not sure we've ever had a customer which only had 9.4% of revenue loss. It's generally a lot more than that, in our opinion.
Well, you know, we can look at that two ways. We can be depressed about it, or we can think about, you know, how much extra revenue there is really if we can somehow mitigate this problem. And so actually the next slide, which is about firewalls, indicates that it just shows that obviously if the operators are thinking about this problem now and starting to address it more. And the number we've picked out there is that we've seen this rise in installation of firewalls since 2013. But it's really started to spike in the last couple of years. So, you know, more than half of those that have installed a firewall did so in the last 2 years. So, Clive, you know, with a bit of luck, you're directly involved with some of these installations. Maybe you could tell us why you think what's happened since 2016 that's made operators go down this route?
Well, I think we certainly see that, seen that in our sort of workload over the last year or two, that things have started to accelerate. But I think it's because going back 2 or 3 years, we found that it was very important for us to actually explain the business case for A2P to operators. And we spent an awful lot of effort doing that in order to explain how there's a revenue opportunity there. We don't have to do it anymore. Operators are very well aware of what the opportunity is. And I think that's really driving the increase in the number of firewalls. But we also see, as well as the sort of demand for new firewalls in greenfield situations, quite a lot of customers are also looking to supplement the firewalls that they've already deployed with managed services or with better analytics in order to do a better job of monetizing A2P. And in some cases, there are sort of some aspects of the firewall they have in place already that doesn't well address the A2P monetization challenges. So in some cases, they're looking to add another firewall for just to address that particular purpose. So so actually, it's quite a complicated picture, but we're seeing increased demand for more firewalls, but also to help operators improve the effectiveness of their existing platforms.
So actually, the next slide indicates some of these other methods that they're looking at to maximize or protect revenues. If we can see that slide. Yeah, so we can see here managed services is almost the biggest factor as firewalls. So to go back to you again, Clive, what do we mean by managed services, and what kind of new technologies and solutions are you looking at delivering to tackle this problem?
Well, I think the managed service thing, I mean, in our experience, it broadly splits into 2 areas. So we have we generally deliver technically focused managed services to run the platform, etc. But probably this more interesting area is that we also deliver revenue analytics managed services, which is basically we provide experts that are familiar with addressing the fraud challenges, which they've obviously worked with lots of operators. They've built up a lot of skills, and those guys are really focused on working with operators to maximize revenues. And we find that works very well in practice and really makes a big difference. Dropping technology into a network and just leaving it there tends not to work. And most of our customers see the managed service thing as a really important factor. As to go alongside that, they also kind of need a mature kind of database of existing known threats. There's no point in reinventing the wheel for every project. So they expect their managed service provider to show up with a kit bag of rules, techniques, technologies to address the known issues today, which can be used as a starting point for securing their networks.
What about things like machine learning, to sort of look for traffic patterns and that kind of thing? Are you starting to see more demand for that kind of thing?
Definitely, and I think it's particularly relevant to the more challenging cases, particularly the SIM farm case. So, if you spend too long detecting a SIM farm, the SIM farmers can do their job, send loads of messages, and then find another SIM card and move on. And you can only really stop them doing it if you can shut them down quickly, and that's where the machine learning techniques are really vital. And if you can shut them down very quickly, then you destroy their business case, because generally they have to pay at least something to get the SIM card in the first place.
Okay, Ben, have you got anything to add on this?
I think the only thing I would say is that the kind of spike, if you like, in the last couple of years of people installing SMS firewalls is people were looking for I mean, I think Clive alluded to this. People are looking for a quick solution. So they said, right, we'll stick a firewall in and that'll solve the problem. And I think it's a lot more nuanced than that. We talked a little bit earlier about the fact that there's multiple different types of fraud, and actually SMS messaging fraud and voice fraud techniques are very similar. Symboxing is an issue for voice as well as for SMS. So I think people said, right, we'll put that firewall in and that'll solve our problems. And now, as Clive says, they're looking for additional services associated with a little bit more refinement of that particular technique. And the GSMA Association has a number of ideas around voice fraud protection, and those ideas can be applied to messaging fraud protection as well. So I think there's a range of approaches to block fraudulent traffic beyond just firewall. And I think it's where the managed service and the machine learning elements come in to actually help provide that level of sophistication.
We actually had a question from the audience while you were answering there, Ben, which was the previous slide we showed about the spike in firewall adoption. One way of reading it is that actually been a drop-off since 2017. Now, I don't know if that's to do with the methodology that you were asking the question when people were still thinking about that and hadn't actually made that decision. But I don't know, Clive, do you think that the slide suggests that there's been a drop-off since 2017? Is that what you've seen?
We certainly haven't seen that. I mean, 2018 has been a lot busier for us than 2017. So I'm not sure what's driving that. As I said before, the interesting case that's happening more and more now is that operators are looking for stuff to augment their existing firewall with. So that's another scenario that's coming along. But yeah, we're very busy this year. We see in our area more firewalls going in this year than last year. So it's kind of interesting.
All right, so we move on to the next finding. It's around self-regulation. I think it's interesting to hear from the M&Os about where they think self-regulation should come from. It seems to be an even split between M&Os mandating their own code of conduct and having some kind of aggregator-led code of conduct. I mean, obviously, from a MEF point of view, the MEF has already devised the code of conduct, which seems to have attracted a lot of support from within the industry. Ben, I don't know if you have any view on where you think self-regulation is right now.
Yeah, so I think that whenever one group or other thinks that self-regulation is the approach to take, it will favour the interests of that particular group, inevitably. I think the work that MEF's doing actually is a great linkage of both ends of the SMS value chain in terms of both origination and in terms of termination. And I think that the fact we have a ready-made code of conduct with MEF, the fact we, both types of companies, aggregators and network operators have been involved in the formulation of the code of conduct indicates to me we've actually got common ground which both communities can embrace. At Tata Communications, we're actually running on a ghost basis at the moment. So what we're doing is we are auditing our own processes to ensure that we align with the code of conduct, and hopefully we'll be in a position to get involved and sign the code of conduct once we're satisfied that we meet those requirements. So hopefully the broader community will be able to take on board the good work that's been done by the MEF members and embrace that code of conduct. And I think that actually the code of conduct is, a set of common sense guidelines. There's nothing in there which is, in my opinion, onerous in terms of what's being required is just ensuring that people respect the best business practices and adhere to the best business practices. So I welcome the MEF Code of Conduct, and we look forward to putting our signature on it in due course.
So if we can move on to the next slide, which is about growing revenues, and here easily the most popular answer was to actually attract more enterprises into the space. So over the last couple of years, we've seen a lot of new use cases, a lot of new enterprises looking into this area. How much growth is left in that, do you think? Ben, maybe I can ask you that.
Oh, I think there's huge growth potential in not just the number of enterprises that are using the medium, but in terms of the use cases which are available. So I think it's the more people embrace mobility, the more mobile customer engagement type approaches are introduced by enterprises, the more scope there is for SMS, and in due course, hopefully RCS, which we'll come on to later. The more scope there is for growth in the marketplace. So yeah, I think there's a huge potential for growth, and we are constantly amazed by the variety of use cases that our enterprise customers are introducing.
Is there a particular sector or vertical that you're seeing demand from? I'm obviously thinking about areas like some of the big new media services, whether it's LinkedIn or Facebook and so on. You're seeing it more.
Yeah, so there's a lot of interest from the next generation service providers, or OTTs, or whatever we choose to call them, because by definition, those sorts of companies are digital companies. But actually, we see insurance companies, we see transportation companies. So a whole range of organizations who are introducing and expanding the use of messaging. So it's not just linked to the next gen type service companies. It's pretty much growth across the board in our experience.
Okay, well, as you said, Ben, one of the areas that growth could come from is RCS. The jury is very much still out on RCS, I think, across all stakeholders in the business. If we can go on to the next slide, we can see that we've got 58% of MNOs expect to launch an A2P RCS service by 2019. So if you add together the first three bars in that bar chart, that's where we get the 58% from. So that seems to be a pretty decent amount to me. Again, Clive, what's your sense of operator readiness for enterprise messaging on RCS?
We're certainly seeing an awful lot more interest from operators wanting to launch RCS services. So I think it's definitely gaining momentum. I think from a security point of view, it's very early days. I think we're not really going to see what the fraudsters managed to achieve and for a bit longer, although I think there's certainly indications that there are some security benefits of RCS compared to SMS. And a lot of our customers are sort of working on plans really to run the two services, SMS and RCS, in parallel. And I think that they can be very complementary in the medium term, I think. So lots of our customers are focused on this at the moment.
Okay, well, we can see from the final two slides further indication of the kind of uncertainty around RCS. So here, it seems like don't know is the dominant answer when asking any of the operators about the impact of RCS or other. So yeah, the jury is definitely still out. But if we go on to the final slide, that sort of drills down more into the impact of the vulnerability of RCS to fraud, which is obviously an area that we're particularly concerned with on this webinar. So here we can see a real mixture of opinions. Again, don't know seems to be the don't know and no seem to be the dominant answers here. So, you know, we should be reasonably optimistic that RCS, if it does emerge as a popular channel, will be relatively invulnerable to fraud. So, Ben, what are your feelings there? Do you agree?
I think the one question mark over RCS, I think there are some concerns about end-to-end encryption with RCS. In the actually detailed results of the ROCCO survey, there was some commentary about whether RCS would be potentially more prone to fraud, simply because there's more medium types associated with RCS. So that's text and video and imagery, etc., etc. There's this end-to-end encryption issue. There's also still a little bit of a niggle, I think, in people's minds about Google's involvement with RCS as well. So I think, you know, we were at the recent GSMA WAS event, and this is just anecdotal sort of discussion, but a lot of the operators that we were having discussions with were still very much kind of in the wait and see phase for RCS introduction. So I think, you know, there's kind of a general, you know, belief, acknowledgement that RCS is the kind of next generation, and that's inevitable. But I think certainly the ROCCO survey results to a great extent, and certainly the anecdotal evidence of our discussions indicate that there's still a lot of people waiting to work out exactly what their commercial strategy is as far as RCS introduction is concerned.
I mean, clearly the commercial models haven't yet to be resolved and could go in any number of directions. But sticking with the fraud situation, how confident are you that some kind of sender registration system could block a lot of phishing and so on from taking place?
I think if people adopt the sender ID approach, which has been proposed, then I think, you know, obviously that gives people the reassurance that the traffic that's coming through is legitimate. That's fine. It kind of comes back to what we were saying at the very beginning of this session about, you know, legitimate traffic versus spam traffic. So legitimate marketing traffic, and the whole sort of premise of RCS is based around actually massively increasing the volume of traffic over the network, and using the messaging channel in very many more ways than is currently the case. And again, I guess I'll kind of be a bit cheeky and throw a question back to Clive in terms of, you know, the sheer volume potentially associated with RCS introduction. Do you see that as potentially impacting the way that operators implement firewalls or implement other revenue assurance type strategies, Clive?
I think it's a little bit early to say at the moment, Ben. I mean, we're doing some work on this at the moment, some R&D work on this to sort of look at the fraud cases and try and figure out what we think might happen in the future and how those issues might be mitigated. I mean, obviously, it's a bit more. The volume of data is huge, and so that poses its own challenges, as you suggest. But I think it's too early to say. I think from our perspective, exactly what the real challenges are going to be from a fraud point of view.
Okay, well, I think we've looked through all the findings now, the main findings. It's been an interesting 45 minutes. Time to wrap it up. I should just add that the final report will be available next week. Look out for an announcement during SMS World for details of exactly when it's available and where it can be downloaded from. So, but with that, I will thank Ben and Clive and Jason very much for their time. And I will remind you that there is a recording of this, so you'll be hearing from MEF about how you can watch the recording again or share with colleagues. But until next time, thank you very much for joining us, and goodbye. Thank you.